Sorting Night Dragon Gramgrace is a card that was released in Set 8. It was actually also released with the physical copies of Dear Days in Japan and FFR, along with the Favrenail that we talked about last week. But Gramgrace itself has 3 abilities. 1, your Persona Ride also increases the attack of your back row units, so your entire board gets Persona Ride power. 2, you can counterblast Soul Blast 1, draw 1 card, choose a card from your hand and call it to back row center. Then also that card can attack from the back row this turn and get an additional 10k power. Then finally, at the end of the battle that the back row center rearguard attack, you can put it into Soul to draw 1 card. Gramgrace is a deck that, for all intents and purposes, is very generic and has some pretty strong abilities tied to it as a Vanguard, but for some reason hasn't really been seen in the sort of highest light when it comes to competitive play. So much so that I made a Twitter post sort of trying to gauge what it is about Gramgrace that makes it not good. I got a lot of responses from that made me sort of think about the deck in different ways, but we'll talk more about that later on. The main playstyle for Gramgrace involves trying to get your 4th attack, mainly involving something like the Knight of Searing Blades, which is a PR that the deck got, that allows it to give Gramgrace an additional 10k and drive when it attacks from the back row, and also using cards like your Dyfin to fill up the rest of your rearguard circles, as the Dyfins can actually power up your middle column anytime a unit attacks from there, each time giving it 5k. In addition to that, Dyfin also has a skill that if 2 units attack in the center column this turn, you can actually counterblast one to get 15k, making it a nice 25k on its own. So the main game plan is to just try and get the Soaring Blades to get your triple drive and have a full board, so you can just beat down your opponent with your massive and impressive numbers. Here's the list. Let's jump into this deck profile. For the Grade 0, we're playing the Starting Magic Star Lily here, which is the Grade 0 that comes with the deck set for Gramgrace. And then for the rest of the Ride deck, you have actually quite a lot of options that you can play. There are what I've deemed to be 3 different versions of Gramgrace Ridelines that you can play. The first one here is going to be the one that I'm playing, which is actually going to be the Youthberg Rideline here. The reason for this is that the Grade 1 Youth has a skill that says when you ride over it with the Grade 2 Youth, you can actually Soul Blast 1, look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose a card with Youthberg in its card name, add it to your hand, or choose up to 1 Grade 2 or less unit from among them and call it to rear, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So we actually use that to just fill up our board and get a lot of aggression on our turn 2. So this is a bit more of like the high rolly version of the deck, which we'll go more into that in the rest of the deck choices. But you can also, instead of that, play the sort of more consistent build to an extent by playing the combination of the Grade 1 Pink Moth Girl Maple and then the Grade 2 Divine Sister Gate Bosque from the deck set. Maple says basically when it's in drop and you Persona Ride, if you don't have a Maple with the same name as her, you can call it out and it gets 5k to the end of the turn. And Divine Sister says that whenever you ride, you can Soul Blast instead of discarding a card to then ride from your ride deck, which means you can very easily discard the the Maple and get that into your drop. The last card that comes from the deck set is the Incision Angel, which I don't really like too much, because it says when rolled upon you draw 1, discard 1. Being that this is a Keter Sanctuary deck that doesn't really use a lot of drop manipulation, specifically this deck, for the most part, you don't really want to discard cards. Actually, you never want to discard cards, which is why we're playing another card in this deck that we'll talk about later, so this doesn't really work out that well. Another version that I played around with was using the Witch of Ravens Chamomile and also the Witch of Frogs Melissa here, which gives you some pretty interesting results that we'll talk about a little bit more later, but this is the second sort of viable ride line that also works in terms of consistency, and it's also more of a safer way to play the deck, but we'll get more into that a little bit later. The final version, of course, is a tried and true Blaster Dark ride line using the Wingull and the Little Sage Marin here. This of course means you have to play a different Grade 0, but this allows you to, whenever you ride over your Marin with the Blaster Dark, you look at the top, I believe 7 cards of your deck for a Blaster Blade or a Blaster card, you won't have any because you only play this. So you just shuffle and then call out your Wingle Brave. It is Brave, right? Yeah, Wingle Brave. To then retire for the cost of your Blaster Dark. That says on place, either on rear or on Vanguard, you can counterblast one retire rear guard to then retire your opponent's rear guard and also get drive +1 this turn. So this allows you to get some extra aggression early as well as some extra cards. It kind of works exactly the same as the youth Rideline that we have here. It's just they're sort of ironically counterparts of each other. Whereas this is Counterblast 1, this is Soul Blast 1. This lets you get extra drive checks, which means extra cards in hand. This lets you get an extra card on board. I decided to opt in to the youth version instead, just because I like being able to get the extra cards out on board. It's very important, of course, for you to get cards out on board. The other thing is that you can actually use this to rush down your opponent early on so that you can close out your game a lot sooner. Gramgrace as a deck overall doesn't really have the strongest grade 3 turn unless it goes second, then it's actually pretty solid. Going first, there's not too much for the deck to do, so this helps out with that. And also it means I get to play the Star Lily, who I think is really cute. And of course, the last card we have in the Ride deck is going to be the Gramgrace. For the grade 3s, we're going to be playing 3 copies of our Persona Ride Gramgrace. No real questions there, I presume. We're also going to be playing a single copy of the Gratis Gradle here. This is a Regalia in normal order that you can play 1 copy of in your deck, because you can only play 1 Regalia in your deck. That says if you have a grade 3 Vanguard and you did not ride this turn, you can activate Persona Ride. Persona Ride is extremely important in this deck, which is why we want to play as many ways to, activate that as we can. Then the last grade 3 we actually have here is going to be 3 copies of the Knight of Soaring Blade Fevnabel. Typically this is played at 4 copies, sometimes played at 3. I like playing at 3 because he shows up in your hand way more often than he needs to, and you have ways to sort of get him back. So you tend to have extra copies of this, and he really doesn't do anything aside from his 1 skill that says at the end of the battle this unit attacked, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, which is why this unfortunately makes Gramgrace a going second deck, you can Soul Blast, discard a card from your hand, choose your Vanguard with Gramgrace, it gets 10k and a drive to the end of the turn. The one good thing about this is that he does go into Soul from Gramgrace's skill and you draw a card as well. So this cost is somewhat free in that it negates the resource gain that you got from Gramgrace, but in exchange you get an extra 10k power and a drive. But yeah, just remember this is only when your opponent's on grade 3, but this is the main target, just about the only target that you want to call to the back row center to be able to have that power. It also works really well with the Dyphon, which we'll talk about later, but it needs to be a grade 3 in your middle column in order to get the power. And of course, having the drive checks with some of the other deck choices will help out a lot. For the grade 2s here, we have ourselves 4 copies of the Knight of Soaring Refinement Dyphon here. This is a card that is also from the deck set for Gramgrace. This says, if a grade 3 or greater in your center column attacks, and you have Gramgrace as your Vanguard, then the unit that's attacking gets 5k. This does stack, so if you have a whole board of these guys, you can give your center column all of that power, which is really nice. Then it has another skill that when it attacks, if you have Gramgrace and your center column has been attacked from twice this turn, then you can counterblast to have this get 15k. This comes up more often than not because of the fact that between Gramgrace and Dyphon and one other card that we'll talk about next, we don't counterblast a lot, so we actually have the availability to be able to do this when we need to it. This is really important on specifically your turn 3 where you just don't have that kind of power, so this allows you to catch up that way. It also makes it so that after you Persona Ride, this becomes a massive, sometimes 58 attack that you can go ahead and swing at your opponent for. Dyphon's a card that I really wish somehow had a way to let you boost, because one of the routes that I was taking was trying to use a bunch of grade 2s and then enabling them to boost with a card that we'll talk about later, because having a full board of Dyphons is insane, but also having like a good attacker in front that doesn't require a counterblast, with Dyphon in the back boosting it is also pretty insane. The next grade 2 we'll talk about here is the Spiral Cutie Angel here. This says when this is discarded from your hand during ride phase, you Soul Blast, put Spiral Cutie at the bottom of your deck to draw 1. Then it says when it's placed, if you Persona roll this turn, you counterblast, look at the top 2, choose 1 from among those, put to your hand, and put the other card on the top or bottom of your deck. So it does say choose a card, so not up to one. So you do have to choose a card. So if you see trigger, you unfortunately have to take one, but you can put the other one on top of your deck. Spiral Cutie is mainly used for the fact that you don't want to discard cards in this deck, right? You want to have as many rears as possible, so discarding them is not good. Likewise, you want to be able to guard as many attacks as possible, and you really don't plus insanely as much as you would like to, because Gramgrace's skill is mainly at best +1 after all of the math is done. So Spiral Cutie helps you get extra cards into your hand, specifically from the main skill, but also just the fact that you can discard it is what it helps out for. So you can also discard it for the Favnabelle that we talked about, the grade 3. It doesn't activate the Soul Blast draw skill. It doesn't have that kind of interaction, but at least it is something that you can discard, which is very important in this deck. And there are times where I've actually used this as a backup for the Favnabelle when I don't have him, because you can play, if you have the extra counterblast, that sets you up to, on that Persona Ride turn, maybe check a bunch of triggers by manipulating the top cards of your deck. So next up, we've got a bit of a weird choice, and I'm going to need you guys to bear with me as I go through this. But we're playing 4 of the Knight of Ferocity Angus here. This is a very simple card. It's a common from set 12 that just says, when this unit attacks a Vanguard, if the number of your rear guards is greater than your opponent's by 2 or more, this unit gets 10k to the end of that battle. So the great thing about this is that it is not locked to grade 3 in any way, shape, or form. Neither player has to be on grade 2. You can actually use this on grade 2, so it works really well with the Youthberg line that I have. Both in that if you call it out, it's great, but also if you call something else out and then call this, you're more than likely going to have more rears than your opponent, making this a nice 20k beater on that turn. In general, this is also to sort of solve for the issue for Gramgrace's turn 3 not being extremely strong, so this allows you to get that extra power. It is, of course, a bit of a high roll, so there's a card that you can replace with this that I'll talk about later that makes the deck overall just a little bit more consistent and a little bit less high rolly from how I'm playing it. But this turns out to work really well since, you know, to make Gramgrace work, you always need 6 rear guards. 6 units total on board. With most decks, maybe sometimes even using their front row to intercept, then this becomes always active. So it's a card that I believe, you know, most people don't realize that it actually comes up more often than not. It's actually a card that I learned how strong it was, more or less, or learned the value of it, I should say, from actually doing a draft from this set. Then the final grade 2 we have here is the atrocious Moth Girl Maple. Maple here has a skill when you ride a grade 3. If you don't have a card with Maple on board, you can call this out to rear. This is just something that we can use in the retire matchup to make sure we have a full board. It also helps out with the previous card. For the grade 1s, to go along with the grade 2 Maple, we have the pink Moth Girl Maple here, who does the same thing. Essentially, when you Persona Ride, you can call this from drop if you don't have a copy of her specifically, and then it gets 5k to the end of the turn. Maple says if you don't have a Maple. So if you have this on board, you can't call the original Maple, but what you can do is if you have them both, is that you can call out the grade 2 Maple first, and then on your Persona Ride turn specifically, then you can go ahead and call out the grade 1 Maple, because this only checks if you have a card with its specific name on board. So then you can get yourself a nice column that hits for 23, but it actually hits for 43 because you Persona rolled that turn, and both your back row and front row get an additional 10k power. Next up, we're actually playing 2 of the yellow Jewel Beast Topaz. I mentioned in my Favnabelle video that I'm basically putting these cats in every single deck because they're just insanely good, and the Keter Sanctuary one is probably the best of all of the cats. So what this cat does is that it allows you to take 2 cards from your soul or a drop that were originally in your ride deck, put them back in your ride deck face up to activate a skill depending on what circle it's on. If you guard with this, it becomes a 20k shield because it gets 15k extra shield. Or if you place it on rear, you actually look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose a card with a grade less than from your Vanguard, and call it. The really cool interaction you can do with this is if you play your Spiral Cutie to ride into your grade 1 here, you can then Soul Blast out the grade 0 of the Rideline. Then you can ride next turn and you Soul Blast out the Youth grade 1 for its skill, which means you already have 2 cards from your ride deck out of the game in drop, which means you can actually hit from the Youth this or call it from hand to then Superior Call again. And that's kind of the thing that I was trying to focus a lot in an original build of this deck, which we'll talk about a little bit later, was trying to Superior Call. One, to be able to get your board full of units, but also two, to thin out your deck. Which is why I really like the Youthberg Rideline, because this allows you to just thin out your deck of units so that later on when you go to your Gramgrace, you just go buck wild and just check trigger, 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 shake your opponent's hand. So this is really good for that, but also the 20k shield is really nice. Plus, it's also in a deck that can actually make use of both cats, so it's possible for you to go to a cat twice. After you Soul Blast out your original Gramgrace from a Persona ride, you then have this cat active again. And since you Soul Blast a lot, cat works out really well. The last grade 1 here is the Bringer of Soaring Winds Lechap. Here that just says in the back row, at the end of your turn, if you have Gramgrace, you can retire this, choose a grade 3 from your soul, and put it to your hand. This works really well with the Fabnabel to get him back so you can recycle him so you don't have to play 4 copies. Also works allowing you to get your Persona rides back in hand. It's also really good on your first grade 3 turn, because you can maybe call out the Fabnabel, not get the skill this turn, but go ahead and put it into soul just to get the extra attack, and then use the Lechap to then bounce it back to hand. Same thing with your Persona ride, just to make sure you get that attack, but you don't lose out on the full intention of that card by it being in soul. This interaction here works really well with the Chamomile and Melissa line that I was talking about before, because what you can do with this is that you can ride over Melissa with Chamomile, who is a Genesis unit, which then activates Melissa's skill here, which lets you look at the top 5 to put 2 cards from among them into your soul, which gives you some soul to be more aggressive with your plays later on, not have to worry about your resources, but also allows you to, for example, grab your grade 3s here, put them into soul, and then use the Lechap next turn to grab them. So it's a pretty cool little interaction that you can try and do if you play this combination of cards. For the PGs, you're going to be playing just 4 copies of the Asmir Dragon. It doesn't have to be this specifically, it just has to be ideally the new version of the PGs that are 6k, and say when you guard with this, you choose one of your units and it does not get hit by an attack this turn. But if you have 2 or more cards in your hand, you have to discard 1. If you have just 1 card or no cards in your hand after you guard with this, you don't have to discard. We're actually playing 4 of this versus 3 and 1 Elementarium, because this is actually another deck that you can actually get away with playing 4 copies of the normal PGs, just because you're trying to get as many units on board as possible. This counts as a unit. It does actually become a whopping 26k if you call this to the back row center, so in a pinch, it could be actually useful to try and push for game. And also, Elementary is not a unit, so it doesn't help in some of the situations where you have to actually call out a unit. For the trigger lineup, it's going to be somewhat simple. We're going to be playing a total of 8 of the normal crits. There's really no need to play the crit that goes into soul, because granted, you do need the soul, so if you want to, you can play it, but I've never found myself actually being able to play it out. I would rather keep it to guard. And you do have, you know, your soul is pretty tight, specifically with this build, but I think you can manage it pretty well. We're going to be playing here 3 fronts instead of draws, just because of all the deck thinning and the drive checking, you are actually susceptible to decking out. And also the fronts power up your front row, so if you hit it on your first grade 3 turn, it becomes pretty strong then, but it's also really good to guard, since you have a lot of, not a lot, but you have usually some cards that you don't want to guard with or that just don't have shield value in your hand. Then we have ourselves just 4 of the normal heals here. Of course, as always, you can change this around however you'd like, but I'm just playing 4 of the normal heals. And then finally for the Overtrigger, we're actually going to be using here the Isto Faro as our Overtrigger. And we'll go into why in a second here. So as per usual for Overtriggers, you have these 4 options. You have the basic Overtrigger, you have the Nation Overtrigger, and then you have the 2 that we got from Festival Collection. And you kind of have to always decide which one is best when you build a deck. I would say there is some merit to each of these. The original Overtrigger here, which just gives 100 million twice, is okay, especially if you check on your first grade 3 turn. It makes that attack, extremely powerful because you have 200 million, and the next turn you can hit with Persona Ride for massive numbers, and then also go ahead and possibly have triple drive. Also, the fact that you do have triple drive in the deck thinning means that this happens, checking the overtrigger happens probably more often than not. So this is an okay option, I would say. The Nation overtrigger just says all of your units perform drive checks for this turn. This one isn't as good just because of the fact that you don't play a lot of grade 3s, so at most you get 1 drive check, which is still good. And if it's like on a Persona Ride turn, that's a really hard to guard column anyway, so that plus a drive check makes things a lot more difficult for your opponent. But because you typically attack with Farvnabel followed then by your Gramgrace, you only really have 2 rearguards that can make use of this. Sometimes, in specifically this build, you attack first with the Knight of Ferocity to make use of the fact your opponent has less rears at that point before the Farvnabel goes into Soul. So you don't always get the max benefit from this, and it's also not very good early on, so I probably wouldn't consider this one, as well as the drawing cards and checking cards, I should say, would actually help you out get your pieces. When it comes to the Valnaut, this is a perfectly okay overtrigger to play in most situations. It just doesn't really give you a lot of benefits in this deck. It's best played in decks that have good rearguards, that have good skills that you want to use twice per turn. Unfortunately, you don't really have that in this deck. The only thing that activates are things that get power, really. So you really don't have any good need for this at the time. You don't have anything that has a guard restrict or anything of that sort. Then, of course, the last card we have here is the one I'm actually using, which is the Idolsphere, who says you can give something a crit and choose a card from your drop. This is sort of just like the safe option to play if, you don't know which overtrigger to play, because this is generally always good. Whenever you check this, it is always good. Getting a card from drop is always good. Drawing a card, obviously, from the overtrigger is good. Getting the overtrigger is good for you. But also getting an extra crit is good. It works as an extra crit in deck, which is pretty good, which is why we're actually ending up playing it. But I could see maybe this getting played, but this just does more than this does for you. For the options, we've kind of already talked about some of them already, but of course you can make changes to your ride deck. As I mentioned, you can play this combination here with the Divine Sister and the Grade 1 Maple. You can play the Blasted Dark package if you'd like to do that instead, or if you'd like, you can play the Witch package here. And I'll tell you sort of the thought process that went behind this. I was taking a look at that thread that I posted on Twitter, and a lot of people gave a lot of insight into why they think Gramgrace isn't very good, or isn't seen as much play, at least competitively. And there's a couple of, reasons for it. One of them being, of course, that we have other decks right now, like Thegre and Youthberg, that kind of already do what Gramgrace does, but a lot better, and have way more support. So there isn't really much to set Gramgrace aside. It does have its own unique quirks, but they're not too differential from those other decks. Another thing is that it has a weak grade 3 turn that doesn't really do too much, and it relies heavily on the Persona Ride. So I tried to take that into consideration, and also fill out the whole of it, needing a whole board to work. And what I was trying to do here is use the Witches here to fill up my soul, use the Lachats to try and get the grade 3s into my hand if I could, but then also using here the Forefront Knight here to try and fix up the holes of the deck. So this is a card that I used to run at 4 copies. It is a card from Set 11 that says when this is placed, other than by a card ability, so it can't be placed from Gramgrace's skill to activate this part, but if you play it from like an order, it's fine. It says if you played a normal order this turn, you can Soul Blast 1, look at the top 5, and call out a card with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard. So between that and the cat, you can get a lot of superior calling going. Plus, I was playing orders to enable that, like the Wisdom of Beginning here, which allows you to counterblast 1, draw 2, and then call out 2 cards or discard 2. But this enables this because it allows you to, of course, draw C into it, but also a normal order was activated, so this becomes live. So you can then use this to call something. But also, going second, this actually gets 10k power, so it was a very easy way to get a nice attacker in. But then that's when I realized that having maybe this in the front row with a Dyphon boosting it would have been great. So originally I was trying to use this order here, which is the Sanctus Sanctus. It's a normal order that just says all your rearguards get boost until the end of the turn. But unfortunately, this whole combination of cards was, something that kind of started working out. Like there was something here, but it just wasn't consistent enough. So I ended up eventually dropping it for what you have here today. Then I'll just go over a couple of the other options that you can play in the deck. We have here, for example, the Drilling Angel. You can play this instead of the Spiral Cutie Angel. This has the ability to superior call stuff, because on place, you put a unit from drop into your soul. Look at the top 3. If you have a card that matches, you can call it out. This helps you fill up your soul. It just has a lot of utility, but you can also discard it if you want to, like the Spiral Cutie. Then we have the Sacrosanct Dragon here, who's a pretty interesting card that says when this is placed by a card ability, you get 5k, but if it was placed from deck, you can Soul Blast, draw 1, and it gets boost. This is a card that I feel like should work in Gramgrace. Keep in mind, it doesn't work from Gramgrace's skill. I originally thought it did. Otherwise, I would go back to what I was thinking in set 9, set 10 when this came out, and building my whole deck around this card. But since you're calling from hand with Gramgrace, it doesn't count. But it does count if you call it off the Youthberg skill or the Cat skill. It's just pretty interesting to be able to get the boost, the draw, get 5k. But for right now, it's not a super crazy option that you can play since you don't have as much superior calling available to you, but just keep this card in mind. Speaking of superior calling, I was originally playing the Knight of Rendering Flash here to try and basically do the same thing that the Youthberg line is doing, where this says on place Counterblast, Soul Blast. Look at the top 3, choose a grade 2 or less, call it, or add it to your hand. So this is really helpful to, get your pieces as you need them, get your Persona Rides in hand, get cards out, but it is extremely cost heavy because it is the same cost as Gramgrace. You can get away with not having to worry about playing cards to get your soul and your counterblast back if you manage your resources well and you don't play a lot of cards that need those resources as I do in this build. But if you play something like this, you'd have to play something like the Tuanar to be able to then be able to get back those resources. I'm not a big fan of the Tuanar because she's a rearguard that disappears, is only able to activate her effect in battle, and also is only when you have 3 counterblasts face down. So she has, I feel like, a little bit too much restrictions. She also has to be boosted on top of all of that. Having 2 rearguards 3 possibly rearguards that disappear from your board makes it a lot harder for you next turn to fill up your board again, because you have the back row that's going into the soul, you have Tuanar that's going into the soul, and then you have the Lachat, which retires itself to pull something out from soul. That means -3 rearguards, which might be good in most cases, but I don't feel like Gramgrace has the ability to fill up the board that easily. The last thing I'll mention here is the Divine Sister Language of Shot, which everyone plays in their Gramgrace decks. It's a pretty fine card. It says if you have a grade 3 or greater in your soul, this gets boosted 5k. It's an amazing card. You can swap this out for the Knight of Ferocity that I have here. Instead, if you want the deck to be a little bit more consistent, a little bit less high rolly, you get 5k instead of 10k. It's pretty much always active. The only reason I don't like the line with the chat is that she ironically clashes with the other Latch in the deck here, because they have very somewhat similar sounding names, because this pulls out grade 3s, which makes this maybe not as active. But you can definitely play like a 4th Favorite Bell, maybe have this trigger. This works out also really well with the Chamomile, the Witch Rideline that I was talking about. That'll do it for the video today. Like I said, I went through a lot of trials and tribulations trying to make this deck work, trying out a lot of different things. I feel like I have a build that I really like, but make sure you take a look at all the different options and make it work for you. And that's kind of like the thing with Gramgrace. It's super generic that you can kind of take the deck in multiple different ways, and I hope people start doing that. But nonetheless, till next time, take care of yourselves and each other, play Vanguard, and have yourselves a damn good one.